I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which is a certified social enterprise with a mission. Our formal mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. We do many different things to try to make a difference. We engage with journalists and parliamentarians and regulators. We respond to consultations. We've even been known to run a march in London. We do all sorts of things to try to make a difference. And the reason we do this is because we genuinely believe that the financial industry is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability, and to political stability too. I have far too many conversations with people who have in some way been shortchanged by the financial industry. That could be somebody who has, for example, had a much smaller return from their investments than they should have done, perhaps because of a lack of transparency on costs and charges or other reasons. We talk to lots of people who are victims of misconduct by the banks, including people who've been sold things like interest rate hedging products, etc. I personally joined the financial sector as a trainee financial advisor way back in 1986. And I remember things like the Equitable Life scandal and the endowment mis-selling scandal. Frankly, there's been one scandal after another. And one of the thoughts that comes to my mind very, very frequently is whether the regulatory framework is as effective as it ought to be. One of the most important things for a regulatory framework to do is to ensure that there is sufficient oversight and control of the system. And it really does seem as though the regulatory framework has not yet found a way to properly govern this sector. Tonight's event is rather niche and rather specialist. You can see the title, Why HMRC's Tax Treatment of Pension Scam Victims is Morally Bankrupt. I spent a lot of time thinking about the right title for this event, and frankly, I was umming and ahhing about whether to be so bold and frankly so blatant with that title. And I decided to be. For a very good reason, which is I believe that HMRC's tax treatment of pension scam victims and other scam victims is morally bankrupt. I'm going to repeat that. I, Andy Agathangelo, genuinely believe that HMRC's treatment of pension scam victims and other scam victims is morally bankrupt. And this takes us to a really interesting philosophical place. What I mean by that is as follows. You can have, I guess, one of two views about things in life. You can have a view that your job is about doing your job, regardless of the rights and wrongs. And we all know how there have been events in history in the past where people did very, 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 very bad things, far worse than the sorts of things we're talking about tonight, where afterwards they kind of tried to justify it by saying, I was just doing as I was told. I was just doing what I was meant to do. I was doing what my officer instructed me to do. And I'm not going to try to judge whether they were wrong to accept what they did. But I do recognize that not everybody did. Not everybody did accept doing what was wrong when they knew it was wrong. Some people stood up rather than stood by. Some people literally lost their lives because they wouldn't do what they felt to be wrong. And I'm not saying that the people who stood by were wrong to do so, even if they felt that doing so was wrong. But I put myself in that situation, and I hope to goodness that if I'm ever asked to do something that I felt was wrong, regardless of what my boss told me or the officer in charge told me, or what the organization's policy was, I pray to goodness I'd have the guts and the courage to say, I don't want to do that. And I'd either leave the army, if that was the context, or run away, if that was what was necessary from the front line, or leave working for an organization that was doing things I simply didn't believe in. So we're going into what is actually pretty complicated questions about morality. During the course of the event tonight, folks, you're going to be hearing from people who can speak with great authority about HMRC's tax treatment of pension scam victims and other victims. And you're going to have the opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to make your own decision about whether HMRC's conduct is morally bankrupt. I have formed my personal view. I'm not saying it's right, but I am saying it is my view. And it is my view that HMRC's tax treatment of pension scam victims and other victims is morally bankrupt. And it's morally bankrupt on two levels. Not only do I believe HMRC are wrong to be chasing victims of financial crime for money, I think they are fundamentally wrong to be doing that when there are sensible, pragmatic alternatives. But I'm even more convinced that the way they are doing it is verging on the inhumane. And at very, very best, it is unacceptable. In 2023, it is unacceptable. When HMRC have a charter that, amongst other things, says they must treat their customers fairly, effectively, it's totally unacceptable. You may already have a view that coincides with mine. You may already have a view that doesn't. Or you may be open-minded and not frankly know what your view is. But tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is a chance for you to develop a more informed position based upon the lived experience of people who've had direct interaction with HMRC. All of our speakers tonight are people that are really, really worth listening to. Sue Flood is a lady I've had the pleasure of knowing for years. Sue, as you know, Sue, you continue to impress me with your dogged determination and tenacity, your willingness to do whatever you can for other victims, knowing it's probably extremely unlikely that you personally will ever benefit from the work that you do. But having felt the pain that you have felt, there's so much humanity in you, Sue, that you are doing what you can to help other people. Thank you, Sue, for being you and for doing what you do. Carly, I've only known Carly for about 6 months or so. My goodness me, what one hell of an impressive person. Seriously impressive person. Not only in terms of capabilities, but like Sue, in terms of her motivations for doing what she's doing. Most, if not all of you, will either know Carly not at all or just a little bit. You'll be fascinated to hear what brought Carly into this space. You'll also be hearing from Sir Stephen Timms, a man who myself and so many other people within the Transparency Task Force community has learnt to like and respect and admire. There are a small number of parliamentarians who consistently do what they can to the nth degree to try to stick up for the ordinary person. And we have somebody in Sir Stephen who is very, very easy to like and respect and admire and find ourselves being grateful for. And you can tell that by the extent to which he goes out of his way to participate and engage and turn up at events and do the things that he does, and even reply to emails from people like me consistently. That in itself is an absolute gift. So Stephen, if ever you doubt it, please understand you are a truly precious person in our world. So thank you very much. And you're also going to be hearing from Margaret Snowden. My goodness me. A shrewd intelligent, articulate, thoughtful thinker and doer who is as good at understanding how to motivate people to do the right thing as anybody out there. Margaret is very, 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 very highly rated by people, not just in the community of TTF, but across the pensions industry, amongst regulators and policymakers and lawmakers and politicians, campaigners, etc. And Margaret is about as motivated as somebody can be to try to make a difference. So please understand, folks, you're going to be hearing from people who, in my world, are very, very special. You're also going to be hearing from Sean at Dalriada Trustees. Dalriada is so close to the epicenter of this topic and seems to be doing all it can to try to make a difference. So, ladies and gentlemen, please be open-minded about what you're going to hear. And if you find yourself disbelieving what our speakers are saying, but you also trust me a little bit, trust me, they are telling the truth. They are telling the truth. I know them all well enough to know that what they say is going to be true, absolutely true. So can we please invite Sue to take to the microphone, and can we please, first of all, put our hands together to show our appreciation to Sue. Please understand how difficult it must be to relive stuff time after time after time, but Sue does it as tenaciously as anybody. Sue Flood, thank you very, very much indeed. Sue,
thank you, and thank you to
you.
all the participants today. It's a tough one for you, Andy, but thank you. Since 2015, you know, we've dealt with numerous amount of people wanting to commit suicide, struggling, family breakdowns, etc., etc. I'm not going to bore everybody with the same speech that I constantly make. So today the question was that the TTF asked, is HMRC morally bankrupt? Tonight, I will explain why the pursuing of victims to suicide causes family breakdowns due to the stress of having, in particular, the art victims, the sword of Damocles hanging over the victims for 13 years and still ongoing would mean yes, in my perspective. Back in 2006, HMRC made changes to their robust registration system for a new occupational pension scheme to a more automated online pension registration system, which meant less regulatory oversight by HMRC. This new system allowed criminals and scammers to facilitate pension fraud with great ease, and then in previous years, no checks, no flags. After just a few years of operating this new online registration system, it became clear to HMRC and other regulatory bodies, the pension regulator, the FCA, which was previously the FSA, that victims were raising concerns, and trustees also of deferred occupational schemes were not getting the support from HMRC when they tried to ascertain if a new scheme was safe to transfer these funds to when they were attempting to carry out due diligence. HMRC's investigation teams were aware that scams were being operated and had highlighted to other regulatory bodies, as mentioned above, expecting them to provide assistance in stopping these scams, progressing by stopping these transfers. The main method to stop transfers actually happened when HMRC asked the pension regulator to appoint trustees to the suspected schemes, which TPR did follow in their own investigations. TPR appointed new trustees to approximately 150 scam schemes that had all been registered with HMRC under this new system. Given the information obtained by the new trustees to these schemes, which showed who was controlling the money in the scam schemes, how the scammers spent the victims' money, how the documents were doctored, faked, which HMRC were aware of, you would think that HMRC would put its full weight behind investigating these individuals and chase them for the return of the money? No. HMRC obtained all of the information it could retrieve from these newly appointed trustees of the victims and then proceeded to hound each and every one of them, treating them as criminals, hounding each person to make payment towards penalty fines and adding interest. These people, victims, were treated appallingly, with no recognition by HMRC that they'd lost their pension money and had been conned by the scammers. There was no support mechanism provided by any of the regulatory bodies to help these victims understand why the full weight of HMRC was pounding on them, with no explanation as to why the scammers were not being pursued by HMRC and being brought to account. HMRC and other regulatory bodies realised that the scammers were indeed successful in carrying out these various scam models, because once the schemes had actually been registered with HMRC and the bona fide registration number issued, the scammers could then register the schemes with the pension regulator and obtain a further registration number, which enabled them to approach the banks and open the scheme bank accounts. So I could recount several examples of scam models and how they operated, how many hundreds, no, in fact, thousands of victims have been ensnared by these scammers. Many were professional FCA advisors promoting these scams, but I won't. All I need to ask yourselves is, 1, why did HMRC not stop these activities from happening once they were put on notice? 2, why did HMRC not pursue the main scammers? 3, why did HMRC not stop the scammers from continuing to register scam schemes? The answer? Simple. Low-hanging fruits. It was far easier for HMRC to turn a blind eye to dealing with 1 to 3 above that I've mentioned, and simply pounding private individuals into submission to extract monies to fill HMRC coffers. These are the victims who are not financially savvy, who are reeling from the knowledge that they have lost their pension. So the question for you tonight, do you feel that HMRC have gone to the dark side, like the scammers, in how they've behaved over the last 13 years in ARC, dealing with victims of scams? If your answer is yes, then we need to get HMRC's moral compass back on track. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry it's the same message, but it is the facts and truth. Thank you very much for your time.
Sue, thank you very much indeed for sharing those thoughts. Sue, I'm going to ask you a few questions, if I may, just to provide you with a chance to elaborate on what I think are some of the key points. So you've explained how, for a period of time, HMRC changed the authorization or registration process, the approval process for people to set up pension schemes. What is your understanding about why they did that? And what have they done? Well, what have they done, if anything, to help repair the damage that was caused by the scammers who exploited that easiness with which they could set up schemes?
So I think it was for a more easier system, which made sense, I guess. A more of a tick box exercise to move into the new technology, perhaps. However, they quickly changed back in around 2014 back to the original situation to rectify those errors.
Thank you. And without going into any unnecessary detail, Sue, is it your belief that HMRC have had formal meetings with people where there is evidence that seems to suggest those people might be scammers, where HMRC missed the opportunity to close those people down?
HMRC met with the main perpetrators back in 2011. They were aware of them in 2010. They missed the opportunity because that particular individual continued until 2016 when struck off by the pension regulator. So there was a considerable period of time of considerable damage that they missed the opportunity to shut them down.
Thank you, Sue. And you've made the point tonight, and you've made the point before, but I really want to give you a chance to emphasize it. You've made the point that HMRC do have powers to investigate and enforce and prosecute, but they seem to spend their time and energies coming after the victims rather than the perpetrators. From your point of view, why does that just not make any sense at all?
Cost-wise, no, but it's an easier route.
So thank you very much indeed. I'd like to, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to, if I may, invite people to come in with comments and questions here. So please, if you have anything you'd like to say in response to what Sue said, whether it's a question to Sue or a comment that you'd like to make, feel free to do so now. Our next speaker is going to be Carly, but feel free to come in now if you have any comments or questions. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you once again, Sue. Please, let's put our hands together for Carly, our next speaker, whilst at the same time thanking Sue Flood. Thank you, Sue. And Carly, you're pretty unknown to this particular community, or at least most of it. So please, if you don't mind, start at the very beginning and talk people through how you got involved in this whole space in the first place. Thanks, Carly.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Firstly, an apology. I've got a really bad throat this evening, but I didn't want to miss this because it's so important. So I'll try my best. I hope you can hear me okay.
We can.
Excuse me. So my background is I'm a lawyer by trade and the wife of a fraud victim. And how I got involved in this was really trying to initially support my husband and then a group of other associated fraud victims. And it was a very long journey in dealing with HMRC and unravelling various tax liabilities that occurred as a result of the suspected crimes against them. That led to me meeting more and more victims and finding that we have what appears to be a systemic issue in terms of a lack of policy for dealing with fraud at HMRC and issues across the spectrum in terms of with law enforcement, with the priority that's given to investment fraud and all sorts of regulatory issues. As a result, I became somebody that many victims were turning to for help and support. And I was getting more and more calls from victims on the verge of suicide. And I received many, many calls, unfortunately. They felt a complete sense of injustice. Many had no means to pay the tax charges that were being levied against them because they'd lost so much money as a result of crime. Marriages were breaking down. Numerous victims that I knew were hospitalised. One, every time we had a meeting with him, and we mentioned the word HMRC, would have a stress-induced seizure. That's the level of trauma he was experiencing. We went to clinical psychologists and they said this is trauma of the highest level. And there was an acute risk of suicide amongst the people that we were working with. And this troubled me greatly. And this essentially is the whole reason that I've been involved in this, to really try to help save lives. I really do believe it's a matter of life or death. I've been on the receiving end of those calls and seeing all these systemic issues that need addressing and reform is desperately required. So I, along with some other parties, helped set up something called the Investment Fraud All-Party Parliamentary Group. It was set up in 2001. We're extremely fortunate to get some cross-party support from both Conservative, Labour and Liberal MPs, all wanting to hear what's happening and to look at the situation and find ways to create a fairer system and to strike a fairer balance. As a result, we relatively recently in June instigated an inquiry to hear from victims and other stakeholders, experts, policing representatives, ex-tax officials, lawyers and others with an interest in this sector, people with experience of these issues. We're looking into the charges being levied against victims of crime by HMRC. In November, on November the 16th, the report will be launched, and we're going to be making various recommendations. But some of the things that have really struck me hearing from the victims, firstly, it's the impact. And when we're talking about ethics and morality, my overriding concern is that people's lives are at risk, and these are victims of crime. And victims of crime, I believe, should be supported after crime. They should be assisted by the system. And the sense that we were getting from victims that they feel persecuted by the tax charges and failed at many different levels. So impact is a real issue. And how do we safeguard the victims? How can we create a fairer system? The second thing that really concerns me personally is the lack of policy at HMRC. There isn't any, from what I can see, any clear guidance as to how should HMRC treat victims of fraud. When are they exempted? When are they not? What are the guidelines? What are the code of practices for dealing with vulnerable victims of crime? There doesn't appear to be a policy. And HMRC's response that they don't feel that they need one. Our argument is that we do feel that they need one. Otherwise, there's inconsistency and there's a lack of transparency, and victims don't know where they stand, and they're suffering all sorts of difficulties navigating the system. And we just generally felt that there was a need for a government review. And we'll be lobbying for an independent inquiry. Looking at the post office scandal, it's very easy to see that this could be the next scandal because of the risk to life and the serious harm that's occurred to victims. There's many different areas that we've looked at in the inquiry, and there's so much that could be done, but this just doesn't seem to be a priority issue at the moment. But one of the overriding issues that victims have mentioned is that the frustration at the denial of justice and the fact that HMRC, with all their law enforcement powers, seem to be prioritising collection of taxes from victims rather than looking at apparent criminality and suspected wrongdoing. And that's something we feel really urgently needs to be looked at. We look at the HMRC Charter and the principles of fairness, and it just feels that in this particular area, the charter responsibilities aren't being adhered to, and that there just needs to be a much greater, we need to strike a fairer balance between victims and investigation of the perpetrators who arguably may have had the benefit. We've also done a lot of research into what happens in other countries. There's no perfect one-size-fits-all solution, but one of the countries that has really interested us is the US. So I just want to really touch on the US system very quickly. Since the infamous Bernie Madoff Ponzi fraud case, there's been all kinds of changes in the US. Firstly, sentences are very tough for fraudsters. I think Bernie Madoff got around 120 years in prison because the impact was considered to be so severe. The IRS brought in safe harbor principles. If you look on the IRS website, if you're a fraud victim, the language is very important. It's about assistance and support for fraud victims. And there are particular rules and very simple rules that Ponzi victims can apply to be exempted from taxes if they result as a result of crime. It's not a perfect system, but it's certainly a different emphasis. And we've looked at other countries as well. There's some countries having similar issues to here, such as Australia, and other bits and pieces we can take from other countries where there's just a more supportive framework. In concluding, I think we do have an issue. I think priority needs to be given to this subject matter as urgent. There needs to be a review, and there urgently needs to be reform.
Carly, thank you so much. Thank you, Carly. And with your permission, I'd like, if I may, to put a few questions to you before inviting others to do so. I was commenting earlier, Carly, that HMRC's way of doing what they do is sometimes inhumane, for want of a better phrase, i.e. they seem to behave as in an uncaring way. Could you speak to that point? Could you share with us the sorts of things HMRC do that make you, me, and many others feel they're being unnecessarily harsh in the way they do what they do?
Yes, I mean, I've had reports come through that there's a behavioural sort of science department, a nudge unit, I think it's called, to try and prompt settlement. And it may be that this has resulted in some of the tactics used, but victims report to us that they feel effectively in a war. Rather than being able to take their evidence and sit and discuss it in a sensible environment, they feel like, the word that we keep hearing is persecution. And it seems that, historically, some of the issues have been threats to bankrupt repeatedly for the rest of a victim's working life, for example. A bankruptcy petition was received on Christmas Eve when courts are closed and there's no means to get counselling or support. All manner, receiving demands at a time when you're at your most vulnerable. So there was this real sense from victims of like a persecution, and just there being no support and no recognition of the crimes that have been committed. So there just seems to be no allowance made and no support and no recognition of the victim status. So on the one hand, you've got the police saying to victims, you're a victim of crime and you're very vulnerable and you require support. And then on the other hand, the victims saying to us that they feel like they're being treated like a criminal by HMRC. I don't think it's necessarily an individual officer problem. I think it's a systemic issue. There aren't policies and guidelines there to say what is appropriate behaviour for victims of crime. And our argument is that vulnerable victims of crime do need to be treated as victims of crime, and there do need to be sensible and appropriate guidelines in place, and recognition of the crimes and the fraud that's taken place.
Thanks, Carly. I sometimes get the impression that HMRC seems to operate, and it probably is, like a massive, great big machine-like monster that's programmed to collect tax without any real sense of differentiation between somebody who might be, a criminally minded tax dodger and somebody who is quite literally the victim of a financial crime. Do you see or detect any differentiation in the way that HMRC approaches the treatment of victims of financial crime compared to other people?
No, I don't. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's the root cause of the issue. There's no discrimination between, let's say, for example, an intentional tax avoider who has cheated the system and a victim of crime who hasn't benefited from a scheme, who was duped into the scheme. So one of our arguments is there should be some kind of traffic light system and refocusing of priorities. So perhaps all the resource should be focused on the criminality and the wrongdoing and the people who are cheating the system. And there should be some mechanism for fair settlements, exemptions, and listening to the full circumstances of the case when it comes to a clear criminality or mis-selling. I had a HMRC tax officer approach me recently and said, and I think this is a really good description of what's happening. He said at the moment it's an approach in a vacuum where HMRC are only looking at the tax charge and tax collection. They're not looking at what happened prior to the tax charge, whether somebody was duped or defrauded or missold, and they're not looking at what happens after the tax charge. So was the money stolen from them? Did they have the benefit? Did they not? It's a very, very isolated approach. And I think that's the problem. If we could create a system where individual circumstances are looked at, and there's a clear discrimination between intentional cheats and fraudsters and people who are cheating the system and victims of crime, that would be a very good starting point.
Thank you, Carly. We'll obviously be covering some of these points during our Q&A discussion part later. In a short while, we're going to go to Sir Stephen Timms, but if I can just put one further question to you, Carly.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of the right polite way of getting this point across. Do you think that there's almost a bullying type culture within parts of HMRC that you've interacted with and others that you know have interacted with? Is there something basically fundamentally unnecessarily harsh about the way HMRC does its job here?
I mean, in my personal experience, it's just been very inconsistent. So I have experienced that sense of a bullying culture and this lack of recognition of the fraud. On the other hand, we've made progress with other officers, and then there's been a change of personnel and back to this sense of, oh gosh, we're having to go through this all over again, and a completely different approach. So it goes back to my points of then being a need for a policy and some consistency. And I think it depends which victim you talk to. Some will, we've heard evidence from a number of victims who absolutely say, I feel bullied, I feel persecuted. And we hear from others who say there just doesn't appear to be a mechanism for HMRC to provide a fair outcome, and it's not the officer's fault, it's the fact legislation isn't there. So there's a real inconsistency.
Carly, thank you very much. In just a moment, we're going to go to Sir Stephen Timms. Before we do that, Sue, if I could bring you just back into the conversation here, because there's a particular point I think people need to understand. When did you first start experiencing the problems you've had as a consequence of being a pension scam victim? And on how many occasions since then have you had the chance to have conversations with HMRC about the way they've been dealing with you?
I initially contacted them when I contacted my lawyers at the outset, all prior to Dalriada trustees becoming involved. So before any government intervention, I contacted Action Fraud, them, and the pension regulator. Myself and another victim went to the pension regulator's office in 2014/2015, after we'd also been to the SFO offices. And we asked if we could see and meet with HMRC. We thought it was imperative that we sit down with them. And consequently, as a result of now getting my paperwork examined by a private professional individuals who now can see clearly a conspiracy to defraud by others. So it's been very much my intention to attempt to speak to HMRC and other victims that I know, but we've just never been granted that. And that request went through Mike Broomfield of the Pension Regulator's Office, Project Bloom, because we really wanted to help them understand with our charts, with our various work that we've done, exactly the links and the frauds that have been taking place. But no, unfortunately, it didn't happen.
Let me get this crystal clear, Sue. You've been battling in this space for 10 years plus? Yeah?
Yeah, about that, because at the outset, obviously, I had a breakdown at the beginning, so it took me a while to get back up on my feet. So yeah, 10 years is an approximate, a good estimation, yes.
And how many actual conversations have you had with HMRC where they've granted you a chance to try to explain things from your point of view? Zero, Sue, zero.
No, and also other people that I know have also requested, and one individual in particular went to HMRC and warned them about a particular scheme that was Salmon Enterprises, which was a fraud, yeah, they didn't take any action on that either. Equally the same as ARC.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you so much. We'll be coming back to these points later. And this is why, folks, I've been saying, and others have been saying, it's not just what HMRC do, it's the way that they do it. And I honestly can't imagine ever denying somebody a chance to talk to me about a problem that they've got that's seriously impacting their lives, the way that HMRC seem to be doing with pension scam victims. It's almost as if they don't want to cover the topic. And depending on how cynical you are, maybe it's partly to do with the fact that they feel a bit awkward about the fact that they dropped their guard and let so many scammers into this space in the first place. That's conjecture on my part, but it might be the case.
Given that people went to Action Fraud, which failed them, people went to Serious Fraud Office that weren't looking into these schemes and the links, given that everybody, City of London police, that myself and another individual went into and actually had to leave there, and we were so drowned that in the rain that we actually walked over to the City of London. When you're talking about people's lives and they're threatening suicide, their families are falling apart, it's not easy to just walk away. So you do try to pursue and continue to try to help them understand. And unfortunately, in this case, HMRC haven't, no.
Thank you, Sue. Just before we go to Sir Stephen Timms, I'm going to share something with you, which is a very delicate matter. It's a very, very sad matter. And what I'm about to say has nothing to do with HMRC at all, zero, but it's still relevant. It's about one of our volunteers, one of the Transparency Task Force volunteers, a lovely gentleman who we got to know very well called Ian Davis. And what you're looking at here, folks, is what's called an early day motion. And what this early days motion is, it's basically a statement by Parliament or some parliamentarians to basically make a point and put something on record. And if you read the words here, what basically happened was that Ian Davis had all of his life savings scammed away from him. And it was as he was approaching retirement. And very, very, very sadly, he ended up taking his own life. He hanged himself, which is off the scale sad. We knew Ian Davis well enough to know that it probably wasn't the loss of the money that caused him to do what he did. It was the 3 years of heartbreak afterwards, going round and round in circles, trying to get support from various authorities, trying to get the authorities to look at the evidence he was giving them about the perpetrators and explaining the investigations he was doing. And we're very, very, very grateful indeed for the parliamentarians that you can see here, who all stepped forward, including Sir Stephen Timms, to support the early day motion, which basically says, for goodness sake, authorities, get your act together, work better together, and do what you can to help these poor victims. Can we please once again show our appreciation for Stephen Timms, who's going to be talking for 10 minutes or so about his perspective on this very, very important matter. And we are going to very much respect the balanced and nuanced view that Sir Stephen has. Mine tends to be pretty one side or the other. So Stephen has the ability to see things from more than one perspective. So Stephen, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andy, for your kind introduction. Delighted to be taking part in this discussion. I think it's an important discussion. Thank you for inviting me. Apologise, Andy, as you know, I have to leave on the hour. Yes. But I chair the Work and Pension Select Committee in Parliament, and the committee carried out an inquiry on pension scams, in part thanks to representations from Transparency Task Force. And we published the report of our inquiry in March 2021. And one of the topics we looked at in the inquiry, and which is therefore covered in our report, was HMRC's response to scam victims. And I just want to set out in summary the evidence that we received. So somebody who accessed their pension early, having been persuaded by a scammer to do so, and that's typically what's been happening in these cases. Someone who does that faces a tax bill of 40% and an unauthorized payment surcharge of 15% on top of that, at a time, of course, when the savings from which those charges might conceivably have been paid have been stolen. Now, we asked, and there was little dispute in the evidence we received, that HMRC's approach in applying these charges is legally correct. One firm told our inquiry, and this was typical of the evidence we received, HMRC has no discretion not to apply the tax charges. But that firm, in its evidence to us, went on and said, for victims of scams, typically facilitated by organised crime, it seems entirely unfair that these people are then subjected to additional tax charges. Many have no means of paying them, and it does feel like a double whammy, having already suffered at the hands of the scammer. That, I think, is the rub here. Another firm told us, so far as we can tell, the penalties were meant as a deterrent to put people off accessing their pension savings earlier than government policy intended, and as such were not originally put in place to cover situations where people have been genuinely scammed. If someone has been scammed, has lost all their pension savings, it does seem harsh that as a matter of government policy, they will then also receive a tax penalty. End of quote. One more quote from the evidence we received. Age UK said HMRC's hands are tied and the ultimate responsibility for how it acts on the law rests with ministers. However, it could have done more. HMRC has acted insensitively and inappropriately towards scam victims, choosing to pursue a literal interpretation of law over common sense and fairness. And we had an interesting joint submission from the Police Foundation, which is the police think tank, jointly with a pension company. And they told us, and I quote, HMRC's approach was described by police investigators, so police officers investigating scams. They said HMRC's approach was unrelenting and uncompromising, overlooking the complexities of the fraud, rendering the victim the perpetrator. And Rick Muir, who's the director at the Police Federation, told us that HMRC's approach led to less reporting of pension scams because victims worry about tax penalties which will be imposed if HMRC finds out. And he went on to tell us, and I'm quoting Rick Muir directly, we did not find anyone who said anything positive about their experience with HMRC. We didn't speak directly to victims, he made clear. Quoting him again, we spoke to police officers who'd been working with victims, and it was they who told us about the impact HMRC's approach was having. Now, could HMRC, in fact, use greater discretion within the current law? There is some scope for HMRC to show discretion. We were told, for example, by one firm that, and I quote, it is possible to obtain a discharge from the 15% unauthorised payment surcharge, but not from the standard 40% tax charge. Now, I don't know whether that's correct. That was their understanding. So in our report, we recommended that HMRC should make greater use of its current discretion to support pension scam victims left owing large tax bills, and that it should do its utmost to provide them certainty where possible, so at least they know where they stand. We said that the Treasury should recognise that in some clearly defined circumstances, and they would have to be clearly defined circumstances, where the saver has been the victim of a crime and made no financial gain from the early access, it may not be in the public interest to demand payment of the tax due. Now, the government rejected that recommendation, and it does seem in reality that changing HMRC's approach is going to require a change to the law. And we recommended in our report, recognising that that was a possibility, that if HMRC is not able to make greater use of discretion, then the government should consider legislation to give HMRC at least the option not to pursue the tax penalties owed by pension scam victims. Now, the Pension Scams Industry Group, chaired by Margaret Snowden, who I think is going to be speaking after me, they have proposed some changes to the unauthorised member payments regime in the Finance Act 2004, including they propose an amnesty of charges relating to payments made prior to a specified date. But where somebody does seek to access their pension before the age of 55 without being eligible for one of the exemptions, we recommended in our report that the pension schemes should withhold the income tax that would be due and the surcharge and pay that to HMRC, so that in the event that the tax isn't due, the individual could then reclaim it from HMRC. But that would then mean that scam victims would at least not be subject to this huge bill on top of losing their pension savings. Now, I've discussed this particular point with HMRC. They've rejected that recommendation on the grounds that it would prove a big barrier to legitimate pension transfers. And I can understand that concern. But that discussion was at a meeting that I had a fortnight ago with the current Economic Secretary, Minister at the Treasury, Andrew Griffiths, who was at the meeting together with HMRC officials to talk about all of this. A point that HMRC stressed, which I know they put in their various letters as well, is that they only charge tax on money that's actually been received by the victim, not on money that's gone from the pension pot to the scammer. They also told me that they bend over backwards to be supportive and sympathetic to victims. Now, I told the official who said that to me, that is definitely not the experience of victims that I've spoken to, and it's clearly not the experience that we're hearing about this evening either. So I pressed them on whether they considered some kind of carve-out for scam victims of the kind introduced in other countries. And Carly has referred to what's been done in the US after the Bernie Madoff scandal. And I do think Carly's research on this is very important, and it's been very, very thorough, looking at changes which have been made in other countries. Now, the HMRC official at the meeting refused to say if they considered it, but he did insist that change isn't needed. And I would say this was a meeting with a minister, that the minister was kind of listening. He didn't really take part in the conversation a great deal. It's obviously not a subject that he's thought very much about. It was the officials who did the talking. So we didn't get much joy from that meeting. I think there is a strong case here, but it's clear to me that we've got a lot of work still to do on this campaign. Thank you, Andy.
Mr. Stevens, thank you very much indeed. We know you're going to be going very, very shortly. Can we please show our appreciation to Sir Stephen Timms, folks, not just for sharing his thoughts tonight, but also for doing a lot of work behind the scenes, along with his many, many parliamentary colleagues in his committee, to try to speak up for pension scam victims and others as well. So, Stephen, thank you very, very much indeed. We've got a couple of minutes or so, perhaps, before Sir Stephen needs to jump off. Could I invite particularly Sue Flood, Margaret Snowden, Carly, and Sean, our speakers, if you have any particular comments or questions you'd like to put to Sir Stephen whilst we have him for the next couple of minutes. Sue, Margaret, Sean, Carly, anything you'd like to ask Sir Stephen before he has to disappear?
My question would be, well, thank you first of all, Stephen, for your efforts. But when you say there's a lot of work to do, what would you suggest as next steps?
Well, I think, Carly, I know you're working on some specific proposals for publication in your report in a couple of weeks' time. I think that's a good move. And I think what we have to do is engage as many members of Parliament as possible in this, so that MPs understand and come face to face with the consequences of what's been going on. I mean, you know, a fair amount of what's happened has been made possible, certainly in the last few years, by the pension freedoms that were introduced in 2015. I think there's a very strong case for MPs looking at what's happened, looking at the consequences of the changes that have been made, and pressing for changes in response. Your work on what's been done elsewhere is really powerful, I think, and I think MPs need to know that other countries have dealt with exactly the same problems and have acted on it, and are not taking the view that HMRC is taking, that everything is fine, we're being helpful and sympathetic, which, you know, clearly does not reflect the experience of anyone I've met. And MPs across Parliament need to recognise that that is the case.
Perhaps what we can do then, in light of the thoughts that have just been shared, is perhaps TTF and Margaret's Pension Scams Industry Group and Carly's APPG and Sue's network, perhaps we can think of a standard letter we think we could encourage constituents to use to write to their MPs to help draw this matter to their attention. We have the benefit, ladies and gentlemen, of living in a parliamentary democracy, and we have the benefit of speaking out. And in relation to that, I'm just going to spend about 40 seconds or so talking through something that I personally think to be very, very important. And here we go. I find myself referring to these words more and more frequently. They're the words from Robert F. Kennedy from the late 1960s. And it's basically about the idea of speaking out when something's wrong. I'm chiming back to what I was saying earlier, folks, that in my mind, I'm not in a position to judge anybody. I wouldn't want to judge anybody, but in my mind, if somebody's doing something fundamentally wrong, or they're going about it in a fundamentally unfair way, they should kick back at that. The words from Robert F. Kennedy: every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice. And that's why the work of people like Sue Flood and Sir Stephen Timms and Margaret Snowden and Carly and many, many others always has and always will command my absolute respect. Speaking up and speaking out is the right way to do things in a parliamentary democracy. Let's all find ways to do that as effectively as we can. And thank you again, Sir Stephen Timms, for being with us tonight. Thank you. Wonderful stuff, sir. Wonderful stuff. We're going to go to Margaret Snowden. I really can't begin to tell you how impressed I am with the professionalism and thoughtfulness and considered approach that Margaret has. Margaret, you know so much about this subject. No need to rush your thoughts, please. Tell us what's in your head around this topic about the way HMRC deal with pension scam victims. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and hello everyone. It's difficult when you're last to speak to be original, but I'll do my best. And I was asked if I could summarise the problems. But first, I thought I might just say that I've been involved in fighting scams since 2014, but my angle has always been trying to prevent them. Trying to stop them happening in the first place. And the reason why I've done that is because I could see things were going very badly wrong. First of all, because, you know, scheme trustees didn't know how to stop people making sometimes the biggest mistake in their lives. There was no real guidance available to schemes and to administrators, etc. So I set about in 2014 to write guidance, to write a code of practice to help it. But I'm always sorry that I didn't think to do it, you know, several years earlier, where a lot of people would have, you know, been protected and not have lost and not be where we are. But you know, better late than never, perhaps. But I like to think a lot of people aren't in the position of several people around, you know, this call because of the work done by my group. But anyway, we're here to focus on HMRC taxation of victims of pension scams. And the first thing I've got to say, to be very balanced, is that HMRC didn't set out to deliberately punish victims of pension scams. The problem comes from legislation which was set for one purpose, which was to prevent tax evasion, now not being fit for purpose because the world has moved on. And we now have pension scams. The law came into being in 2004. In your pension liberation, as we're generally talking about tonight, didn't come about until 2008. So it was after the legislation. Not that that's an excuse, but I'm just setting out the framework. But pension liberation, really became a big thing. And it grew so much because scammers could see a massive opportunity to trick people, to fool people into doing something that they would never dream of doing, which is take their money out of their pension scheme and transfer it to a bogus arrangement. And the whole point of those bogus arrangements was to misappropriate the funds. And quite sadly, in some respects, and the thing that's most damning is that people often got some cash back. They were taking a cash sum, which they thought was perfectly legal, taking a cash sum out, which was a hook to get them to transfer their money so that it could be stolen. And that set HMRC's face and the government's face against the victims, because they did get something, and we've actually heard the word, made something of it, got some money back. And that's been the cruelest thing of all, is that hook has actually been used to make it harder for us to get HMRC to do something different. So yes, victims did actually break tax law. That's not really in dispute, but what we're saying is they did it because they were duped. They did it because they were lied to. They did it because they were deceived, not because they were trying to get one over on HMRC. But as we've heard throughout the call, authorities treat victims as if they're guilty and apply tax charges. And I have to stress that they apply tax charges, not penalties. And the reason I stress the difference is that a tax charge is very difficult to remove, whereas a penalty can be forgiven. But they're very clear that they're tax charges and not penalties. And unfortunately, it seems to be a very British thing to blame a victim and somehow say a victim's at fault for, their own misfortune. And that's something we really ought to change. And as Sue said, in a lot of the cases, the people who were doing the advising were regulated. They were given permission to advise people on transfers by the FCA. And that gave them, a real veneer of respectability. And if they weren't regulated, a lot of them were pretending to be regulated, and they were allowed to pretend to be regulated for far too long. And as Sue also mentioned, HMRC weakened the registration process, which made it easier for scammers to set up vehicles to then be able to misappropriate assets. And there's been very limited redress or compensation available to victims in lots of other walks of life. If somebody's the victim of a crime, there is a compensation available, but for pension scam victims, that's not been possible. And well, until now, there are things that might be done under certain circumstances, but probably over 1,000 victims have lost most of the savings and face a tax charge of about up to 55%. And the reason for that number 55%, it's not magic. It's for HMRC to claw back tax relief that people got on their pension when they paid contributions in the first place. So it's been calculated to claw back that benefit that people got, and somehow that makes it even more cruel. But that's the way it is. And despite now knowing, because we've been fighting this for rather a long time, despite knowing that people have lost their savings, they've lost families, they've been in a terrible state. The tax position hasn't been altered. It's not fit for purpose, but we haven't altered it. So I was also asked to say, well, what have we done about it? And we've been doing stuff for quite some time, and it's beginning to get a little bit more momentum, but it was quite disappointing to hear Stephen say, we still have a way to go. There still is work to be done, and that just seems to me again to be pretty cruel. We all recognise, and more MPs are recognising that this is all wrong. And we need to have a different view, but we'll carry on fighting. But this is just a painfully long process. So as Stephen mentioned, PSIG, my organisation, put together a paper in 2019, which was submitted to the House of Lords and to a Treasury committee to try and persuade them that a change in the law was needed on the tax front, even giving them the wording how it could work, and told them the cost, and the cost of forgiving the tax charges is around 20 million. Now that's pocket change to Treasury. That's just a small bump in the road. It's not a significant sum, but they still wouldn't do it. So if the law can't be changed, we have to think what else we can do. And we've heard discretion mentioned. HMRC don't have discretion in this matter. They've got discretion in charges, that are levied against a scheme, which are actually penalties, but not against individuals. So there's very limited scope for discretion, and there seems to be very limited scope for kindness, and that's a bit of a shame. But one thing I will say, that they're resistant to changing the law, and I've met with HMRC several times, and HMRC actually told me as well that if I can persuade ministers that this is changing the law is the right thing to do, they said that they'll advise parliamentarians against it. So we're kind of up against an unwillingness to change, and that's what I find really quite bad. But I have to say, it is possible to remove tax charges, because the Chancellor managed to do it in a single stroke at the last budget, and he removed the tax charge from the lifetime allowance. So it is possible to do it. He just spoke and that was it, done. There is no charge, unauthorised payment charge on exceeding the lifetime allowance. The whole thing's a bit of a mess, and it's a bit of a basket case, but because the regulations haven't been written. But as we speak, there is no tax charge for exceeding the amount of pension in that event. So they can actually do something if they want to. The Chancellor could do it on the 22nd of November when he does his autumn statement. I've submitted freedom of information requests and had them refused, as it's in the too hard basket and would cost too much to tell me. Gave information to the Working Pensions Committee. You heard from Stephen, and that again was ignored by government. Worked with the PPF as well to try and have them consider raising cases under the Fraud Compensation Fund, and that's not something that would help individual victims, but it would actually help schemes get back the monies that they've lost, and therefore be in a position to distribute those monies to the victims who've lost their savings. And also working with TPR to try and find ways around some of the technical problems that arise when you try to get things through the FCF. And very pleased to say, more recently working with Carly on the APPG and investment fraud, and that's been quite inspiring for me, because until that point I felt I was ploughing a lonely furrow, and it was only pension scam victims who were suffering this problem, to discover that it's actually almost universal, and that just reinforced my view that we need to do something. So I'm very grateful to Carly for inviting me, and thoroughly impressed with all the work she's done. But I do think it takes joining up in this way to have HMRC pay attention. I met with the government's anti-fraud champion, and Carly and I wrote a paper to him to explain the whole situation of investment fraud, pension fraud, and I'm waiting to hear back. But he did actually speak publicly about it and was quite complimentary about it too. So I'm very hopeful that somebody of his calibre will actually help to do something about this. And very recently, a few of us, including Sue and Andy, sort of met with Alex Bankrupt, the MP, and he asked me to prepare a paper which summarised the issue for MPs. And I think, that plays a little bit to, the comments made earlier that we need to engage as many MPs as possible to try and press for this change. So in sort of summary, and I'm probably taking up too much time, but what do we need to do? Well, we need to do some things to try and undo the harm that's been done to individuals, and also to society as well. So we need to change the culture of victim blaming. It is actually heaping harm upon harm, and the scammers are the only ones that should be blamed for all of this. We also need to change the definition of a scam, because in a sense the bar is a bit high to try and prosecute them, and that's why we don't get them prosecuted. So we need to lower the bar a little bit, but we also need to make it very clear that a scam is a bad thing, and it's not just some cheeky chappy in the background making a few bob at somebody's expense. It is actually a criminal endeavour, and a lot of it is professional criminality. We do need to encourage people to report to action fraud, and it's a very hard thing to do, because action fraud don't really take action, and the reporting systems are not very good, so they need to be improved. But if we don't report scams, they just constantly parrot that there is no problem. It's a bit of, we see no ships because we've got a blindfold on. So we need HMRC to change its stance and to have a policy, and that's something that Carly has already mentioned that she's fighting for, and I completely support that. We do need the tax law change, and I won't stop fighting for that, but we need to also resource up the police and the courts to prosecute scammers, and that's why I think we need the bar to be a bit lower, so that we can actually get those guys, get at their assets and help to put things back where they should have been. So we need to fast track the fraud compensation fund. It hasn't paid out yet, but it is a fund that's there, and as long as fraud was involved, they should find reason to pay compensation to the affected schemes. And if we don't want to do that, we need to create a hardship fund, and that would have to come from the industry or from some of the firms that are involved in some of this behaviour, and ideally, as Carly proposes, get money back from the scammers and use that money for good, either to pay the tax that's due so that the revenue doesn't lose out, but also to compensate victims. So I'm really hopeful that the APPG that Carly's leading on will actually be successful. And if not, I think the next step is we need a petition to be set up. And Stephen Timms thought that would probably be quite a good idea when I put it to him a wee while ago. In the meantime, VSIG continues to fight the good fight to try and make sure that scams don't happen. We need to get funding because we do it all for nothing. We need to get funding to create a database which will help people spot scammers. Name names, which is a very dangerous thing to do, but it is possible if we could set ourselves up in the right protective way, and we just need money to pay some expensive lawyers to help us to do that. There is apparently a way. So that's kind of all I wanted to say. HMRC are following the law. They are doing what they've been tasked to do, but it does upset me that they seem to be quite willing to wear that coat and would actually fight against any move to change that.
Margaret, thank you very much indeed. You've once again reinforced my very well held views that your knowledge and your thoughtfulness in this space is absolutely second to none. Margaret, thank you. While thanking Margaret, let's also welcome to the microphone Sean Browse from Dariada Trustees. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Margaret. Sean, if you're happy to spend a few moments introducing yourself and sharing your thoughts on what can be done about this HMRC approach to the treatment of pension scam victims from your point of view. Thanks, Sean. Thank you. Thank you, Margaret.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, thanks, Andy. So just quickly, I work for Dariada Trustees, firm of professional trustees that the regulator appoints, and we have been appointed to a number of these scam schemes, including the scheme to which Sue is a member, I'm not sure there is an awful lot I can add as to what we need to do with HMRC to the comments made by the previous four speakers. The issue, to my mind, is lack of consistency and just downright doggedness and intransigence from HMRC. I can talk very quickly, not least as there's only about 5 minutes left, but the whole approach to just to go back a step, in situations where there are these liberation payments that Mark talked about that have led to the tax charges on the victims, those payments also give rise to charges on the pension schemes making those payments. Now, we challenged the tax charges that were levied against the ARC schemes. We went all the way to the tax tribunal, a process that took 10 years or more to actually have a decision that was handed down earlier this year that actually found against our arguments and basically found in favour of HMRC. And to say that that was disappointing is a massive understatement. But I think it's worth making the point that we tried at various stages in those 10 years to try and get HMRC to maybe see sense is too strong, but to reach what we considered was a fair and reasonable, if accepting the point that the members are victims of fraud, and the question as to whether they should or shouldn't pay tax at all, even if it's accepted that there was some tax payable, the basis on which those tax charges were applied in the case of the ARC schemes, there was an alternative basis that was much more easily understood by members, was much fairer, and would have resulted in a much lower tax burden on the members. And we argued that. We put the case to HMRC. We tried, as I said, on a number of occasions to try and reach an agreement with them that would not see us have to go through this tribunal process, and they just point blank refused at every stage. Now, as I said, they may well argue that that decision was justified because ultimately the tribunal found in their favour, but it's just symptomatic of the lack of flexibility and the general doggedness that other people have spoke about, that HMRC just stick to their guns, and there is no moving them. But beyond that, yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. That there has to be some recognition that members, or members of these schemes are victims of fraud in some form or other. And to a certain extent, that is evidenced by, I mean, Margaret touched on the Fraud Compensation Fund. We are working, 99% of my working day is now dealing with the Fraud Compensation Fund and trying to get the schemes to which we have been appointed, of which we are currently trustee to well over 100 of these types of scheme, and we are trying to get the majority of those schemes through the Fraud Compensation Fund. So yeah, I lost my train of thought now, how I got onto the subject of FCF.
Okay, Sean, I'm going to ask you one quick question.
Yeah, ask me one question. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll then go to general Q&A, and I'll invite all the speakers to share their final comments before we bring the conversation to a close. From your point of view, Sean, you used a great word earlier. The word you used was intransigence, the unwillingness for people to change their position. I met with, some of you will know, I met with then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, along with a couple of people who were pension scam victims that Sue Flood introduced me to, Mr. and Mrs. Burgess, a lovely couple. And it seemed to me that Boris Johnson was genuinely quite open-minded about trying to do what he could to help. And the correspondence I sent him got sent to the Treasury, and the Treasury basically came back with a letter that said HMRC's job is to apply tax law. And it was pretty kind of binary, and it was pretty kind of cold. It wasn't Boris that came back with something pretty cold. What came out of the Treasury was pretty kind of cold. And it kind of felt they were being, that perfect word that you just used, they were being intransigent. Do you think, Sean, that's where the problem is? It's almost as if they've taken a position on this matter, and come hell or high water, they're not going to be shifted off it. And perhaps if ever they are shifted off it, it would look like they should have been shifted off it years ago. Do you get the impression it's that kind of dynamic at play here, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think, others have said that, Margaret said, that there is arguably little they can do on the member tax charges because they're tax charges, they're not penalties. So that almost gives them a license to, there is nothing we can do. Our hands are tied. I don't necessarily believe that for a minute, and certainly in the context of the conversations we were having with them in relation to the scheme charges, there was definitely something they could have done, but they just stuck with the the line that these are the taxes that are payable. I mean, it's an interesting thought. And again, come back to something Margaret said, one of the things that PSIC is trying to do is, one of the things they were looking at was this amnesty. And I do wonder if actually something along those lines would actually be more useful, because arguably all of these tax charges that we're talking about today have all derived from these pension liberation schemes that various speakers have talked about, and where the scammers basically got the members into the scam scheme by way of the hook of a promise of a payment. And there is an argument, and only time will tell and experience will tell, that model, that type of scam, should be less of an issue, less prevalent, with the changes that we've seen in legislation over the last few years, particularly the changes to transfer regulations. with generally the greater awareness around liberation is a bad thing. You know, you've got the Scorpion campaign, you've got all of this sort of communication scam, smart TPR, whatever. I think there is now probably a much greater awareness that liberation is bad. So certainly something that wasn't there at the time that the likes of Sue and the ARC victims got involved in the ARC schemes. You know, that wasn't there at that time, but now it is. And I think the scammers have evolved and moved on. And certainly, if you look at our experience, you look at some of the schemes that we've been appointed to more recently, liberation's not been the issue. It's just been blatant investment fraud. You know, you've got the hook to the member is no longer you can have a few quid in your back pocket. It's your deferred pension sat there doing, you know, earning no interest whatsoever. You know, let us invest it in this fantastically profitable investment. You know, insert scam investment of choice, whether it be car parks, green energy, trees in Brazil, and the whole raft of things that we've come across in our time. You know, and they make the promise of these fantastic investments, and that is the hook that gets members in, this magic 8% that we talk about. And to the extent that sort of, if you like, future scams may not be focused on liberation, and so the tax aspect of that falls away. I wonder actually if a better focus is to actually start going around Margaret's amnesty route and actually saying, look, you know, we've got a cohort of people here who are subject to tax, who are victims of a particular type of scam, a liberation scam, and let's see what we can do for this cohort of victims.
John, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. Thank you very much. We'll be thanking all of our speakers later after they've each had a chance to share their final comments. We'll go in the order of Sue, then Carly, then Margaret, then Sean. But before we get there, we're going to go to Richard Loxton and then to Richard Emery. Both would like to come in with comments and questions. Richard, to you first of all. Thank you.
Okay, right, thank you. Firstly, just to say that I'm not a victim of pension fraud, but I've been watching this session with great interest because I'm on behalf of other people who have been victims of pension fraud. I absolutely take this view that the comparisons with the post office scandal, the APPG, they're just so close, they cannot be denied. I put into the chat a thing about the A1P1 rules, which make it very clear that no matter what what I believe the taxation law is secondary, the primary law is the Fraud Act. So even if you're a government institution or whatever, you cannot say we can ignore the Fraud Act because our secondary legislation says we've got to do something. That's my understanding of the A1P1 rules, and I would be very pleased if people could come up with their considered opinion, whether I'm right or wrong on that very simple point. And I'm making that on behalf of other people who are not at this presentation.
Richard, you've raised a very, very interesting line of thought. I'm going to pop something in the chat in relation to what you just said, Richard, and thank you for raising that point. It'll be definitely a place to go to look for some guidance on this. Is there perhaps a breach of the Human Rights Act here? Thank you, Richard, very much indeed. That's a very thoughtful point. Mr. Richard Emery, for those of you that don't know Richard really is a tremendous subject matter expert on things like authorized push payment fraud, and he does a huge amount of work on a purely pro bono basis, helping people who are victims of one kind of financial crime or another. Richard, to you, sir. Thank you.
Just I wanted to come back on a couple of things. One, to endorse the comment, action fraud has an IN on the front of it. It is inaction fraud. The stuff that I've had dealing with them is we have a criminal investigation well set up, and yet when people have submitted information to action fraud has said we can't link it to any existing investigation. So they definitely need to be reformed. But the one thing which I wanted to say was a lot of what I'm focusing on now is about prevention. It's about going to the banks and saying, let's prevent the fraud. And what I really don't understand, and what, you know, I know what I've been following some of what Sue's been doing and others have been doing. What I really don't understand is why they haven't picked up on what Steve and Tim said, which is that the existing fund should deduct the charge in the same way that when a bank pays interest to me, they deduct the income tax. Now, if I shouldn't pay the income tax, I can get it back later. But I fail to understand why, over the years, we haven't managed to achieve a situation with HMRC and others where the actual process says when the transfer takes place, the sending fund has a responsibility to deduct the tax. I mean, just as an equivalent, in a way, I've just gone through an ISA transfer and I've had to go to the new ISA company. The new ISA company has had to go to the existing ISA company and ask for the money. You know, it just seems to me that the system, I'm appalled at how long ago it was identified that the system was broken and the extent to which HMRC have obstructed developments in the system, such as the tax deduction, the tax charge deduction being made before the money is transferred out of the scheme. I think it is appalling, and I applaud all of those of you that are working on this, you know, Stephen and Sue and Margaret and now Carly. Power to you. Keep going, fight for the just solution and fight for a long-term solution to the problem. So well done, all of you. But yeah, this is just appalling. And incidentally, Margaret, you talked about scam. Yeah, that's the problem I have with authorized push payment fraud. Some of the banks want to call it a scam so that they downplay it. It isn't, it is fraud. It is fraud, it comes under the Fraud Act, and it's something we all have to recognize. So just a brief comment.
Richard, thank you as always for your input. It's always valuable, always valuable. I think it makes sense connecting you with Carly because some of your APP movement of money could be useful for Carly and the team that she's got around her. And similarly, Juan, I would love to bring you into the conversation, please, Juan. You're a man that I've only known for a relatively short period of time, but over the recent months, I've become very, very impressed with your subject matter expertise around fraud and forensic accounting and those sorts of things. Juan, would you like to briefly introduce yourself and share any comments that come to your mind, if you'd like to?
Thank you, Andy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Juan Carlos. I come from general accountancy practice, so I have three angles on this, you know, from accountancy, taxation, forensic accounting in relation to fraud. From what I heard, there's one thing of concern in relation to HMRC, and that goes in line with the response that Stephen got from HMRC officer, and also in relation to Margaret comments about HMRC. And sometimes I feel that we make a lot of excuses for HMRC, and HMRC becomes quite dishonest more often than we think. In relation to following the law, there are many occasions where they don't follow the law on the basis that even when there's an upper tribunal decision and they don't agree with it, then they go ahead and change the statutory instrument to make their own law, regardless of what the decision was. In other occasions, they apply different interpretation and they impose that interpretation as the law, and then they don't move from that position. Also, when it comes to giving evidence before the committee, Public Accounts Committee, they are not transparent and clear on the issues. Even in on their own report of performance, they also show that things are better than they actually are in practice. And I would like to bring a point, because it's related to the pension as well, about the proposal from Rishi Sunak to introduce artificial intelligence for people to check their pension information. Is that going to bring more scams? Is one of my major concerns as a risk. And I made a post in LinkedIn about that.
Juan Carlos, thank you very much indeed. I've just put a note in the chat that my colleague Alexandra will read tomorrow morning, which is to introduce Richard and Juan Carlos to Carly. Carly, I feel that Richard and Juan could be useful contacts for you. They've both got really, really focused subject matter expertise. Okay, would anybody else like to come in with any other fresh comments before we go to our speakers to invite them to share their final comments before we wrap up? So wave something at me if you want to come in with a comment or a question. Otherwise, we're going to go to Sue, then to Kylie, then to Margaret, then to Sean. It looks like we're good. I really do hope you found tonight's session interesting and useful. And after we heard from Sean, our final speaker, I'm going to just put an idea out there and see what you folks think. But Sue Flood, your final comments, please. Thank you.
I'll keep it succinct. HM Government Treasury, the Pension Regulator and HMRC must be held to account for the injustices caused by the fraudsters in being the architects of these policies, which significantly contributed to the frauds occurring through poorly thought through legislation and still today scars the victims from 13 years past with emotional, poor health, mental health issues as a result, and contemplating suicide still. We need a full review be commissioned for an open and transparent inquiry of what occurred behind the scenes of HMRC government departments, as I've mentioned, that continued to allow the denials of criminality that was enabled, and how these victims have continued to suffer with the regime that HMRC employ against them in unwarranted tax demands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much. We go to Carly. Carly.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Andy, for organising this. I think it's been incredibly useful. I'd like to encourage anybody who hasn't given evidence to our APPG inquiry, whether a victim, an expert, anyone with a point of view, please contact me or Sue and provide your evidence. We will be producing the report very, very soon. Next week, we're finalising the report and we're launching it on the 16th. And we hope that will be the beginning of a new campaign, some fresh impetus and new MPs supporting us. And I agree with everything that's been said tonight. There needs to be reform, there needs to be change. It is going to be difficult. Joining forces is the way forward. And keep the faith, keep going. This is a roller coaster of emotions for everyone. We've all been in this for such a long time. I've been in it for 8 years. I know there's many people who've been in it for longer. Justice doesn't come easy. We look at Hillsborough, we look at some of the big challenges, the post office, etc. But there's a clear issue here, and victims are suffering. So it's worth every ounce of effort. And thank you.
Carly, thank you. So well said. So well said. You really are an inspiration in your own right, Carly. Let's go to Margaret. Final comments, Margaret.
I'll make a couple of comments. One, I hope that the paper that's winging its way to MPs will actually generate quite a lot of interest and make sure they understand the issue. And the issue of pension liberation is a contained issue. So there isn't actually a contagion problem that, HMRC seem to like to say. And my second point is, after this, I really do feel even more strongly that the change in tax law for pension liberation victims is essential. And the greatest irony is that if the Fraud Compensation Fund pays out as a result of discovering that fraud has been the reason why so many people lost their savings, a lot of the money, without a change in the law, a lot of that money would go straight to HMRC rather than to the victims, and that must be avoided at all costs.
Margaret, thank you so much. Thank you very, very much indeed. Sean, your final words, please. Thank you.
I think, again, coming last, you have to echo the thoughts of those that went before you, and I think we just need some sort of recognition, coordinated effort to get HMRC to see sense, and that the victims of these scams get proper and fair treatment from HMRC and appropriate treatment. and that has to be achievable somehow, and we have to, for want of a better expression, make HMRC see sense.
Thank you very much indeed. Your comment, Sean, ties in with what I'm about to say. I'm going to share my screen again, and this is an idea for Carly to consider amongst her colleagues in the campaign strategy that is underway. So what you're looking at, folks, is a letter that the Transparency Task Force organised back in March. It's a letter to, in this particular case, it's a different subject, different topic completely, but it's a letter to Harriet Baldwin in her capacity as the chair of the Treasury Committee. I'm not suggesting it would be Harriet Baldwin that would receive such a letter. It could be, for example, Sir Stephen Timms. But what the letter basically says is, dear Harriet Baldwin, here's a long list of sensible reasons why the Treasury Committee ought to open an inquiry on SME finance and something called the Business Banking Resolution Service. So the letter is the letter. And Carly and co are perfectly capable of writing a very, very good letter. So it's not the letter I'm drawing your attention to. What the bit I'm drawing your attention to is we managed to get a lot of other organizations, not just the TTF, who had a similar view on this particular topic to put their name to this letter. And as you can see, we had a few all-party parliamentary groups in there, and we had the Federation of Small Businesses in there as well. We also managed to get a couple of specialists, a guy called Mark Bishop and Nishka Techa, at something called the SME Liaison Panel. It doesn't matter what that is, but it's just a couple of specialists. But we also, have a look at this, we also managed to get some MPs. And there's no doubt about it, getting parliamentary support is the way to try to get things done in a parliamentary democracy. There's a wonderful phrase by somebody, a famous campaigner in the 1960s, who basically said, no politician can live with a hot topic if you make it hot enough. His point was that if we can make this a hot enough topic for politicians, they will act. And that's why we were so pleased to see this long list of parliamentarians who got involved and literally put their name to the letter, And as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we put a lot of time and effort into this. We got all these MPs to show their support. Now, for those of you that deal with MPs or interact with them, you'll know how difficult it is to do this, but we managed to do it. And the reason we managed to do it is because the case for what we were asking for was so clear and so sensible. And we also managed to get some members of the House of Lords to do the same thing. So Carly, perhaps the report that Margaret's written and that you've written could be part of a piece of correspondence to parliamentarians and others. And not only that, we also got some actual victims of the thing we were raising awareness of. And when we organised the letter, we were quite crafty, we were quite cunning. We deliberately organised the list of the victims by constituents. So, for example, Lorraine Adams here is a constituent of Bob Seeley MP. And obviously, this was designed to encourage the parliamentarians to want to be seen to be supportive of what these constituents are asking for. And it worked really well, and we got the inquiry open that we wanted to get opened. And it's just an idea for you and your colleagues to think about, Carly. If you were to want to do something like this, and it's just an idea, the detail doesn't matter, then the Transparency Task Force, and I'm sure the all-party parliamentary group we have the privilege of being the secretariat for, would be absolutely over the moon to work with you and to support you and to try to create a bit of a campaign momentum around this kind of thing. And bearing in mind, folks, of course, that we have an election coming up. So if ever there's time to ask parliamentarians for a bit of support, now's the time to do it. And who knows, it might even take a change of government before we actually get somewhere and get the ball in the back of the net. but it's worth a try, isn't it, Carly? Carly, any final thoughts? You have the final words to closing the meeting. What do you
I'm
think?
going to bite your hand off for that offer of support, Andy. 100%.
Okay.
Yes, please, let's do it. I've already approached the Treasury Select Committee via Andrea Leadsom, who's my MP, who's on the Treasury
Fantastic.
Select
Yeah.
Committee. They are absolutely the right people to do this, but they're not doing it at the moment. So I think your methodology will be more successful, and I'd like to do that straight away with you. Thank you for the offer.
You're most welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to finish today's meeting with a phrase that came up in an event we ran last night. By the way, today's event is the 6th that we've run in the last 2 weeks. So we've been so busy. I'm going to put the phrase in the chat as well, because I think there's a bit of wisdom in it. I kind of stumbled across the phrase, made it up last night, but it's really resonated with me. I'm going to put it in the chat, then I'm going to speak the words. Bear with me while I just type it out. I think there's some wisdom in this. I'm going to put it in the chat, and I'm going to speak the words, and I'm going to explain it. So long as somebody hasn't given up, there is always hope. So long as somebody hasn't given up, even if we individually feel like we have given up, so long as there's somebody else out there that hasn't given up, it can spark something that leads to a flame, that leads to an inferno, that makes all the difference. So long as somebody hasn't given up. And speaking very, very frankly, when Carly kind of appeared in our life in the last 6, 9, 12 months or so, she really has kind of reignited a sense of enthusiasm. I think you've picked that up from Sue Flood's comments. I think you've also picked that up from Margaret Snowden's comments, you know. Carly, you're making a real difference, and we all want to support you and what you're doing as much as you can. I know that you also are bending over backwards to do what you can to support Margaret's message and Sue Flood's message. And on that hopefully very positive note, we'll wrap things up, folks. So long as somebody hasn't given up, there is always hope. Even if we've given up, so long as there's somebody else out there that hasn't given up, there is always hope. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a privilege and a pleasure hosting this. We'll pick up on the ideals, we'll pick up on the energy, and as always, we'll be as tenacious and determined and robust and bloody minded as we need to do to get the ball in the back of the net. Thanks all. Good night. Thank you very much indeed, folks. Thank you. Well done. Good night all. Good night all. Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Carly. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Margaret. Thanks all. Thank you, Sir Stephen Timms. I know you're not here, but you are with us. Thanks all. Good night.